Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're about 1 minute out, so we may have some people joining, but I just want to be respectful of your time and get started. So just thank you for using the chat to drop in your locations. It's really amazing to me that there's people from so many different parts of the US and parts of Canada. I may have missed if there's any people outside of the US or Canada. So if that's you, that's awesome. We'd love to see you pop your location in here. My name is Dia. I go by she, her pronouns, and I'm going to be your instructor for the next couple weeks. And I'm really excited to do this class for a number of reasons. Number one, I think that this is an opportunity for us to develop community. We're all obviously coming to this place from a different level of understanding, but it's an opportunity to come together. Number two, it's an opportunity for us to learn best practices and take it back and apply it to our workplaces. And then number three, it's just an exciting time. I think that we are, for some of us, coming out of the pandemic. So this is a time when workplaces are looking for a new and refreshing way of doing things. So collectively, we can share our expertise and apply our expertise. So let's get started. Okay, so what is DEI? Basically, we are going to go through 12 classes together, and this is our first one. I wanted to start by saying that I reviewed, some of you filled in a form with your expectations, and all of you are here for different reasons, but one of the things that came up is that a lot of you are interested in professional leveling, and what I want to say is that always come equipped with resources. So if you're planning on taking this course and then taking the learnings and applying it back to your workplace, come equipped. So whether that's articles, books, frameworks, one of the things I do that's a really low lift exercise is to sign up for Google Alerts with the words diversity, equity, and inclusion. So every day I get an inbox full of really interesting stuff that's happening. And then another really great practice is when you're going to networking events, keep your, I don't know if you know about this practice, but keep your QR code open on your phone, and that gives you a chance to add and grow your network as much as possible. Okay, so please feel free to use the chat to ask questions. We're going to have a 15-minute Q&A period at the end. But let's go through this bit by bit. Okay, so over here is the 12 classes that we're going to go through, and today we're going to just do an overview of DEI. The reason I start with this, and I've read through your expertise, there's some of you that are very well versed in this topic, but from my experience, it's really important to do some very good foundational level setting. And when we're trying to teach others about the value of DEI, we want to make sure that we're including people that don't necessarily know the topic very well or how we're talking about it in 2022. I want to pause and just say that as a practitioner, one of the lessons that I've learned is that sometimes we're not here to compete with others who may have more opportunities than us. When I was in the corporate workspace, I found that some people had more access to teaching DEI. Perhaps some of them have the privilege that I didn't. A lot of them were white men. But what I decided to do is actually step out and decide to focus on my own unique skill set. And I had to take a step back and say, okay, either I can compete with this person above me who seems to have twice the number of opportunities, but maybe half the amount of education or expertise, or I can create my own framework and my own path and my own way of doing things. And that's what attracted me to, and that's why this class appeals to me, because it's an opportunity for me to share my expertise in my way. So if one of the things that you want to do is that professional level setting, I definitely encourage you to think about your unique skill set, your superpower, and how, if you were framing something like this, what would that look like to you? Okay. So this order works for me. Ultimately, we're going to culminate in a DEI strategy, But think about what works for you. Would it be this way? Would it be taking one of these and then going into detail about that? Having your mind thinking like that is a great way to think about how you can be in the best position possible to either teach DEI, be a leader in DEI, or continue to upskill in your space. Okay, so this is me. I am Dia. Again, I go by she, her pronouns. And a couple things about me. I am the founder and DEI strategist for my own consulting practice called Global IDEA. IDEA stands for Inclusion, Diversity, Equity in Action. I've lived in a number of different countries, including Canada, Germany, Japan, the US, where I am now, and also Singapore, which is where I was born. I'm a former Amazonian, and I think that's a really important piece because if you're looking to learn how to do this at scale, I've developed strategies for 1.3 million employees. I've worked with the C-suite, so definitely created an influence strategy for them at Amazon. And personally, I was a DEI columnist for the Seattle Times. I have a bachelor's of journalism and a master's of education, and I identify as a woman, a mother of one, a masi, which means an aunt, to two little boys, and a leader. And I say leader because there's 6 inclusive leadership traits that are easy to remember. They go by the 6 C's. So we have collaboration, curiosity, cognizance, community, and 2 others. And I realize that I'm skilled at all 6 of those, and frankly, so are you. So I think that's a really important piece when we introduce ourselves, is not just introducing ourselves in our professional way, but also in our personal way. I wanted to give a quick shout out. There's an incredible strategist, DEI strategist by the name of Dr. Janice Gassam. If you're not familiar with her work, I would definitely encourage you to look her up. And she's been writing some pieces lately about how we need to redefine professionalism, and how for a long time in the workplace, professionalism looked like this image that you see here, somebody crossing their arms, and they just have a particular look that we're comfortable with. But what does it mean for people if we redefine professionalism so that it's a more accurate version of themselves? And she speaks specifically about how Black hair in all textures is professional. And so I encourage you to challenge our notions of professionalism by saying, I am not just one identity, but on multiple identities. These are the different skill sets that I bring to the workplace. Okay, so as we go further, I want to encourage you to start thinking also about what it means to recruit people for both their professional and personal experiences, and think about your area of DEI. So let's use the chat here. If you are skilled in a particular area of DEI, or you're interested in a particular area of DEI, I would love to see it there. Thank you, Jen. Yes, Dr. Janice Gassam. And if you're not familiar with a particular area, or if you don't practice a particular area, that's fine. But I say this because DEI is everything, right? It's basically everything that we do in our workplaces and in our lives to make sure that we're including people in the best possible way. So if we challenge ourselves to think about what our particular skill set is, then all of a sudden we have a unique superpower that we can bring to this conversation. Fatima, thank you. Intersectionality, we'll be going into that in the next class. Any others? Recruiting, Desiree, thank you for sharing. Conflict transformation, thank you. So as we develop community, this is an amazing way to read the chat and say, okay, awesome, Jen's an expert on facilitating. Dr. Nate, I see here that your skill set is conflict transformation. So we can really lean on each other to learn from each other instead of just trying to be the expert in everything. Great, thank you everybody for sharing. Okay, so as we continue to see the different expertise dropped in the chat, very quickly, our course structures that we're going to be meeting on Tuesday and Thursday at 5:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and there's going to be one assignment per lesson plus 3 module projects, and you'll see the word optional next to the assignments that are optional, and then there's ones that are mandatory. Collectively, you would need 80 points to get that course certificate. If there's any challenges with this, or if you're finding yourself needing more time, please do message me. I do have a background in education, so I know how important it is to not just put something out there and get you to deliver on it, but in a way that's meaningful to your growth and understanding. I'm going to be running office hours 30 minutes before, and that's an opportunity for you to come in and ask questions. And finally, we have that channel both in Google Class and on our phones on WhatsApp, where we can continue to share resources and ask questions there. Okay, so over here we have how to engage. For those of you that have done DEI in the workplace, it's really important to come up with some sort of rules of engagement. I don't like the word rules, but some suggestions on how people can best engage. I want you to look at this and tell me what your favorite is out of the 5. So these are just the 5 that I think lead to a really dynamic conversation. But in our next class, we're going to ask you to come up with an idea. Is there any here that stand out to you? You're welcome to name it, either from what's written here or 1 to 5, with 1 being create brave and safe spaces, and the last one being communicate solutions versus problems. Okay, so a couple people are saying call people in. Yeah, I wanted to give a particular call out to this one. I had a woman her name is Monique Castro. I definitely suggest you look her up. She's part of an organization called the Indigenous Circle of Wellness, and she came and spoke at Amazon, and she spoke about how I don't know if you're familiar with the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and how that has been coined as something that's been created by Maslow, but it actually came from an indigenous practice. And she was talking about how, in terms of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, a lot of it is rooted in indigenous practices. Circle healing, learning from one another, calling people in. And that really resonated with me, where in our attempt to try to move back from how we've been trained is the right way to do things, we can practice a different way of doing things, but we have to give credit where credit is due. So I want to give credit to Monique and her sharing of indigenous practices of calling people in versus calling people out. Okay, so next we have how to participate. This is one of my favorite slides. The reason is, as we do DEI work, we want to create content that's sticky, and we want to create content that is easy to remember. So I came up with this framework called the 3 T's. Because of my background in education, I learned that nonverbal communication is 80%. So in the US, we often have been told that, your way of communicating is talking. That's not true. 80% of communication is nonverbal. And because of that, we want to invite people in through what I call the 3 T's: talking, typing, and thinking. And it gives us a chance to slow down, right? We're not trying to compete with one another. And when you're sharing this with your leaders or your organizations, you can create your own framework, but the consistency with which you use this is really effective in other people seeing you as a leader and seeing how this translates to the work. Another example is I came up with a framework called the 3 A's. The first A is awareness, the second A is accountability, and the third A is action. And what I say is, every time we have DEI content, we want to make sure we're hitting on all 3 of these marks. Another example is ABC, always be curious. But as you see, it's really punchy, it's really easy to remember, and you can attach an icon to it so that people remember it. A couple other things to add quickly is that there's 7 different learning styles. Some of us are inward processors, some of us are outward processors. There are people who are neurodivergent, which means atypical brain processing. And culturally, there are 8 different cultural values. One example is, are you direct or are you indirect? So the more we learn that about each other, the more we're able to create those spaces where we can share thoughts and ideas, which lead to better products and services and in some cases, better policies and practices to create equitable workplaces. All right, so one question I wanted to use the chat to ask you is, looking around, so we're seeing each other's faces here, we're seeing each other's names here. Who do you see in the conversation? And conversely, who do you not see in the conversation? So some examples could be, that's something I see here. Okay, interesting. Yeah. The more comfortable we get asking ourselves these questions, the more we're able to see whose views may not be represented. Majority color, yeah, not many male identified folk, not very many male. Okay, which means that we're never fully getting that representation. But what we can do is we can say, if we want better representation, who do we need to call into conversation? Yes, Dr. Dunlap, thank you. Few light-skinned people, yes, absolutely. We're not seeing that many here. That doesn't mean that, it's not open to them. It just may mean that they may not be feeling like this is the right course for them. Okay, so class agenda, we're going to go through 3 things today. One of them is definitions, differences and examples, and then we go into the critical years of DEI 2020 to 2021, and then differences in various parts of the world. I'm just quickly going to see if I can add my closed captioning. Question for you all, if you're familiar with Zoom, do you know if there's a way to do this? I want to make sure that I'm making this as inclusive for everybody as possible.
Do you see where it says subtitles at the bottom? Do you have that on your screen? Because if you already have closed captioning available, everyone should be able to do it automatically. So it might not be added yet if it's not on the bottom of your screen.
It would have been something that you set up when you set up the Zoom.
If someone has it on theirs, they can request, and I'm pretty sure I'll activate it on the host.
Okay, thank you for
I think you do have to set it up, because I set it up for my webcast, so I was called out for not having it before, so yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for doing that. I will definitely set that up as soon as possible. And if any of you are able to set it up and send me a request, I will definitely make sure I accept that. So apologies if it's not there right now, but we'll definitely make sure it's there for the next class. Of course, for those of you that are asking me privately, of course, no problem at all. I'll make sure that's taken care of. Okay, now one of the things I'm going to do in this course is practice in real life some of the practices we want you to do in the workplace. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this. For those of you that aren't, there is an amazing resource. It's nativeland.ca. It's a Canadian resource built by a great organization that functions on a volunteer basis. And a lot of companies, organizations, nonprofits, profitable companies use this to acknowledge the land that we're on. And the way that you do is you click on the link, you say where you are, and it will give you the land that you're occupying. So please feel free to use the chat to do that. While you're doing that, I wanted to call out a contradiction that I've been noticing in the workplace, and that's a lot of organizations use this resource, but I don't see them donating to it. So if you have access to the ears of leadership, or you are in leadership, please, let's take this a step further from using this to actually donating to this organization and those that run it. We're definitely seeing a lot of practice of land acknowledgement, but are we doing anything beyond just calling that out? So thank you everybody for sharing where you are located based on using this resource. Sorry, Monique, I just sent you a private message. I meant to send that to everybody. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot that I haven't seen before. Okay, so we're going to go into definitions right now. And again, the whole point of this is to do level setting. It's also a way to find a groove. And from what I found from doing facilitating and DEI work for many years is that every time you do this, you incorporate a new angle. And the reason is because we're learning from each other. So very basic, very simple, what is diversity? This is a great slide that I like to use because right now we have diversity on the call. One resource I wanted to show you, I don't know if you're familiar, but there is a wonderful woman by the name of Annie Jean-Baptiste. She works for Google. She's the head of inclusive product, and she wrote a book, Building for Everyone. And on page 88, she refers to 11 dimensions of diversity. And if you're ever looking for a reference when you're doing this work as to what some dimensions are, some of the ones are listed here, such as race, gender, geography, ethnicity, disability, age, religion, and a few others. But I want to challenge us right now in the chat to think about other dimensions of diversity. And I will start with one, but please feel free again to use the chat because this work is always evolving and changing. Sorry, the book name is Building for Everyone, and I'll drop it in the chat. She's a wonderful practitioner, again, who just speaks from the perspective of using an inclusive mindsets to build products and services in the tech space. Is it pronounced Kara or Kara?
Oh, Kara.
Kara, thank you for sharing. Yeah, body image and shape, absolutely. Education, diversity of thought, able-bodied privilege. Yeah, we're seeing great ones here. Another one that we're seeing a lot of organizations trying to extend our diversity dimensions to include is caste. Because a couple years ago, there was a case that came out by Cisco that said some people felt discriminated against by caste. So I definitely read up about that and see where we are on that. Okay, so that's diversity. What we have on the call, inclusion, of course, is when people feel comfortable being themselves. So you take that image and you start getting people interlocking hands here to say, we're connected. How can you be yourself? I want you to start thinking, because this is the assignment. Again, it's optional, so don't feel like this is one you have to do. But the assignment that I have for you all after this class is how you would explain this to leadership. So it's not just understanding it, but how you would use your practices to explain this to them in a succinct way. There's a wonderful practitioner by the name of Jody Ann Burry who has done a TED Talk on asking ourselves whether it's even worth it to be authentic in the workplace. So as we do this work, we want to ask these challenging questions, and we want to credit the people who are bringing, focus and attention to the questions that matter. So equity. Okay, again, I have another bit of a gripe with this, as I'm sure you all do too. Equity is providing everyone with what they need to succeed. It's a principle of fairness. I know there's a couple people here that have a background in equity. They're working specifically in equity-focused spaces and places. So if you have some added definition, please feel free to use that in the chat. And Faith, yes, I will be explaining the optional assignment in one of the following slides. But one of my gripes with this is that we're seeing a lot of organizations using E in DEI without putting the word equity in practice. So if we're going to use that, we want to make sure that we visit the principles of equity and we don't just use it without doing the work behind it. So the next slide is specifically about the difference between equity and equality. For those of you who are new to this, I would definitely suggest using an image to explain this as you do this work and explain it to others. There's 3 different variations that I come across. This is a great one because it shows that if we give everybody the same materials, it doesn't mean that they have the same success. There's another one for those of you who may not have seen of animals who have been told to climb a tree, and you have like a snake there and you have, a giraffe. But the idea is it doesn't work the same way for everybody. there's a version of people standing on different boxes, trying to look over a fence. And then we bring in the concept of justice and saying ultimate justice is not having any barriers. And then finally, there's a piece about an apple tree where people are trying to pick apples. And the concept of equity is if people are of different heights, how can they reach the apple? And all this is saying is that people with privilege have more access and opportunity than those that don't. And for us to create a level playing field, we want to create different programs and policies, different environments for people to succeed. Yes, I will definitely link to this source. Let me just make sure I add that into the chat. And thank you for asking. Andre, equity is the middle child that isn't used properly. Yeah, that's a great example. See, I told you, you learn something new every time you do this class. I haven't heard that example before, but I have to ask, are you a middle child?
Me, no. I'm a firstborn. So.
You're a firstborn. Okay, so maybe referring to your sibling there, but yeah, that's a great example. Okay, so I added in this slide last minute, and I'm really glad that I did because 15 characteristics of white supremacy culture. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it. It is an example of that sticky content that really resonates with people. It's interesting how I think a lot of us have tried to explain some form of this in some way or another in our DEI work. But when people see it like this, I think it resonates differently. Maybe it's that all 15 are listed together. Maybe it's that the words, one of them has to resonate with you, if not all. So I would definitely pull on this resource. It was shared by Okun and Jones in 2001, and here we are 20 years later, and we can definitely see the truth in this. Question for all of you: have you all seen this? Have you all used it? And if so, what are your thoughts? Like, have you found that it's landed in a way that has influenced others to take action? All of these resonate, yes. Coming from Amazon, I can tell you that every single one of these was practiced in the big tech industry. So far, I see here you asked a question, if you used it, how? The main way that I used it was when I was trying to, and this is one of the most challenging things in the DEI space, regardless of the size of the organization you're part of, is people putting the resources behind it. So I had put together a strategy and I'd asked for a particular budget. And of course there was that hesitation and when I added this in, I said, the budget is meant to work on 3 of these, on dismantling 3 of these and reintroducing new ways, and this is how. So I specifically say 3 because as a seasoned DEI practitioner, the power of 3 is really effective in getting people to buy into your ideas. When you say you want to work on all 15, people say, whoa, 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 and they end up wanting more strategy, more ideas, more et cetera, et cetera. But when you pick 3, it's like they say phone numbers are created with 7 digits because it's memorable. So I would definitely pick the 3 that are most specific to your organization and what might be limiting your organization from doing their best work possible. So for example, with Annie Jean-Baptiste's book, and her focus is on inclusive product marketing, she, for example, could use the example of, a sense of urgency. If we do that, then we're not really bringing in people's opinions from different communities. I want to give you an example of something that happened at Amazon. I don't know if you're familiar, but the Alexa team at Amazon hired Samuel L. Jackson to do some sort of a voiceover, and in the voiceover he was swearing left, right, and center, and they didn't run this past the Black employee resource group at all. And when it came out, people were rightfully very upset about it for a number of reasons. Most of all, it it fills that trope of Black men being aggressive. And second of all, who made this decision, right? So in hindsight, they did I don't remember what it's called, but they went back and they reviewed their decision making, and they said the sense of urgency that the organization put on them made them skip over the people and the groups that they should be talking about to even figure out whether this would be received well by users and consumers. So I think that's a good way to use this, is hone in on the biggest problem that your organization may be facing, show them the slide, and then follow up with your particular ask. Okay. So evolving language, this is another great piece here. POC, or global majority. POC stands for people of color, underrepresented or historically marginalized groups, people with disabilities or disabled people. All I'm pointing to here is that language is always evolving, and I wanted to share a resource with you. It's actually linked in our resource section, but are any of you familiar with James E. Wright? He works for Google. Yeah, I see some head nodding there. So he has come up with a resource. It's free. It's called The Language of Inclusion. I believe it's on version 4, but it's basically a glossary, and it's alphabetized. So it goes through all the words, not all, but as many words as possible, and gives you a definition behind it. So as we're trying to get people to buy into our strategies and our ideas, as we want to get them to give us the budget, or whatever our goals are, we can give them a glossary as a resource. Okay, so Jillery, is that how I pronounce your name?
Yes.
Jillery, yeah, I agree. So Jillery's point here is that we could use this whole session to talk about the 15 characteristics of white supremacy. Absolutely. What I want us to do is to try to use our work to come back to that piece and continue to use that piece to see how we can disrupt those through the workplace, right? So let's definitely focus on that as a thread throughout all of our work. Okay, so the main point here with the evolving language is to always ask. We have a lot of people on this call from Canada. We have a lot of people on this call from the US. And one main difference is that the term BIPOC, for those of you that are familiar, is actually from Canada. It originated from Canada, but the way it lands in the US is often quite different. And I say this as a Canadian living in the US, that it doesn't always translate the same way. So we want to be able to use different terms and generally ask people. Okay. Great quote by another DEI practitioner that I would consider following or adding, Arthur Chan: diversity is a fact, inclusion is an action, equity is a choice, and belonging is an outcome. Another one that you may all be familiar with is by the very well-known Verna Myers. Some of us think her name is pronounced Verna, but it's actually Verna. Verna came up with the quote, diversity is being invited to the dance and inclusion is being asked to dance. Diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance. I share this because a lot of people really resonate with this. So when we share it, they just say, wow, I get it now. So that's another one that I've seen a lot of great conversation around. I wanted to share a best practice in real life, and that's when you're developing a DEI strategy, let's choose the terms that we really want to focus on. So are you all familiar with JEDI? So justice, equity, diversity. Okay. So we're seeing a lot of organizations do that now, and they're not doing the work to back it up. And we're seeing a lot of people calling that out. So if you're leading this work, before we just put an acronym or a letter next to it, let's decide if we're even committed to that to begin with. And if you decide to keep the work in D and I, that's fine. But if you're going to add that E to say you're doing equity, you have to back it up. And if you're going to add the J, or whatever other version, the B for belonging, we want to make sure we're committed to that. Okay. So the critical year leaders for DEI. I am sharing this slide here because there's 5 different images from across the world, specifically Nairobi, Rio, Berlin, Montreal, and Seoul. This was following the murder of George Floyd, and Black Lives Matter was a global movement. And we say this often because a lot of organizations talk about it as this is a US context. No, people were organizing all over the world. And I'm going to drop a link in here. This is one of the most powerful resources that I have come across. It's like a photo book of images of over 20 cities across the world and how they gathered after the murder of George Floyd. And you can see how powerful this was. So when we share this with leaders, we're not just, approaching them with statistics or words, we're approaching them with images. And remember, coming back to the 7 learning styles, some of us are visual learners. So when we see that, and we see that from the view here, and we say, oh, okay, we're not putting the resources behind it, then we suddenly feel like that spark. There's a great quote out there that says, to get people to change, you want to be the spark that starts the fire. So things like this are images to say, we're the ones that are being left out of conversation. So we want to make sure that we're being as, responsive to things as leaders as possible. So the next slide I have here is search traffic for DEI. Have you all seen this yet? No? Okay. We can see here that with the increase of Black Lives Matter protest, so too came with it an increased Google search traffic for DEI. Again, this is another great resource that points our leadership, or if we are in leadership, to the need for more resources, perhaps hiring more people to say, with the increased search comes the increased need for more resources. And clearly this is something that everybody is looking at and will continue to keep an eye on. Another great slide here, this was from Glassdoor, is that we are seeing that there was a dip in human resources. So it's a little hard to see, but human resources is the green line that's consistently under. So the hiring of people in roles of human resources is a little bit underneath, but you can see a spike of DEI roles as the blue line represents from 2020 onward. And what we want to do as we go through this class is to make sure that we keep the resources up so that the work can be done. I'm a big proponent of this, that if we're going to do this work, we cannot do it from a place of burnout, right? And burnout comes when the expectation surpasses our physical, mental, and so many other abilities to be able to fulfill the needs of our organizations. I want to take a pause because I want to talk about burnout for a minute. For those of us that are practicing DEI, let's say 1 is a low-level burnout and 5 is a high-level burnout. Where do you feel you may be in that space right now? Yeah. Okay. So I'm laughing not to minimize, but the 10s, that's quite telling. That's quite telling. And what is the one thing that's leading? There's many things that lead to burnout, but is there one particular thing that's leading to burnout for you more than others?
Is it okay to speak?
Of course, please.
For me, it is the commitment of just honestly just white people that want to stand in solidarity and don't understand the cost of solidarity and in unintentionally hurting people of color in their efforts. And that is really where the burnout happens for me.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. I see a lot of head nodding here in empathy. It's what you said. I'm not even going to follow up with that because I think what you said was perfectly put. It's just the pain of being put second or last. And I say second or last because for me as a brown woman, I have a very different experience than a black woman or a black trans person or somebody that's indigenous. It's painful, and we need to find ways to support each other as a community to get through this. I apologize. I don't know who was the next person to raise their hand. Patrice, did you want to share?
Yes, thank you. So for me, it's the fact that our work, in my opinion, isn't something that you get an ROI of immediately. So there are plans, there are initiatives. It's a slow burn that's exhaustive, but it's meaningful. And so that's the burnout for me.
Thank you for sharing. Sadia, is that how I say your name?
Yes, thank you. A quote I pretty much live by, and especially when I set my boundaries in any space, but particularly whenever I'm the most knowledgeable when it comes to EDI, and somehow the responsibility falls on me in those spaces when people are in quote unquote learning. I always remind people that I don't need to be the bigger person when people are always smaller. It comes from a quote to not always be you don't always need to be the bigger person to small people, because it always comes about where for people of the global majority, or depending on the intersection of the gatekeeping and oppression that you face, it's always that deflection of a responsibility and accountability to put it on the people who are not only being put in these positions of that flipped pyramid, to not only be in a rock and a hard space, but also be the savior. And it's a weird, toxic twist of saviorism from that space to not only own the saviorship and the respect and the celebration, but then to shame anyone else who's not part of that saviorism as being agents of harm. So always have your boundaries, everyone, especially when you're educated, because people be wild out here.
Yes. Thank you for sharing that. The savior complex has to be named, in the sense that I think a lot of people, even within DEI, who are practitioners, are guilty of the savior complex, but I don't think we've called them out on it yet. Not that it's our responsibility, but I haven't heard a lot of people call themselves out on it yet. So what I've started to do in my decks is actually have a slide on the savior complex, so that we can talk about how this is definitely showing up, especially in the DEI space. We have to be mindful of it. We have to, and one of the most effective things we can do, to your point, is maintain our boundaries as a community. Jillery, please feel free.
Yeah, I think the burnout for me comes from two kind of places. The first is the ways in which many of our institutions are to deal with one system of oppression at a time. And so what that does inadvertently is give resources only to anti-Black racism, only to Islamophobia, only to homophobia, only at once, forgetting intersectionality. And then you have somebody like me who's Black and Muslim and all of these things together. And that becomes exhausting to always have to compartmentalize resources. And I think that as communities who identify as marginalized, we often buy into it. So we often also, some of the folks in my workplace that I'm having to remind about the ways in which our identities intersect are often people who I think, because of their identity, should have a better understanding. And the second, I think, piece that is exhausting for me is how good people have become in adopting the language of EDI, and presenting as though they get it, but when their back is up against the wall, when we're dealing with crises, when now we're really confronted with the way the institution is upholding white supremacy, they go back to their business as usual. that is exhausting. To feel like you have done all this work to bring people along and given all of your emotional energy and professional energy, and you're getting paid, but that I still don't check myself out at the door. To just see all that work kind of unravel because people are all of a sudden not brave or not willing to prioritize.
Yes, allyship. I know a lot of fellow DEI practitioners that have actually stopped using the term allyship. I am still in favor of using it, but I think that it's really important to include pieces on performative allyship versus authentic allyship and present it to the folks that we're trying to work with or convince or bring along and say, one is detrimental to our health, whereas the other one is what we want you to invest in. So we have to be very careful. There is a great image out there of the actual differences between performative allyship and authentic allyship. Performative allyship is a lot of branding, a lot of saying the right word, to your point. And so my advice in this case is to make sure that our DEI functions do not sit in marketing. Not to say that marketing does not play a role, it absolutely does, but the closer DEI sits to leadership or in leadership or with a direct line to leadership, the closer we are to making that change. So what I'm trying to do is offer you a best practice here that we can actually implement. And the best practice in this case would be to make sure the design of the organization puts the DEI functionality in its own space, but directly linked to other places. Okay, Kara, sorry, I mispronounced your name again. My apologies, please.
It's okay, as long as it's not Karen, I'm good. Yes, it's Kara, but no shade. But y'all preaching today. I will say for me personally, I've been doing this work for a little bit of time. And I will say this, the biggest issue that I'm having in terms of burnout, and someone already alluded to this, is, I'm going to just be honest, end stage capitalism. People have these unrealistic and unrealistic goals of what it means to do this work, and they think they're doing it, but there's a difference between doing it and doing it with fidelity. And they're not doing it with fidelity. And so I find that oftentimes, most of us in this space, from what I see visibly, identify as people of color. And because of that, we are put into these roles specifically, sometimes as figureheads, sometimes as change agents. And I love that Saudia said, I intentionally stopped using the word Jedi because I am not a Jedi Knight. That is rooted in white supremacy, white supremacist culture, anti-misogynoir, name it. We put it all on everything that we're talking about. And so someone said, yeah, because you're a Jedi Knight. I said, hey, no, I'm not. And I said, first of all, you're not paying me enough to do this work. For everything that you want, you have no clear roadmap or direction for where you want this work to go. And it's leading in all different paths that are no alignment. Also, too, my biggest area of burnout is that they see DE&I work as a form of unidimensional structure. This has to be looked from a multidimensional lens. I can't look at people as man, woman. I have to look at you for who you are. So it's almost like performative nature. We put up an QA plus pride flag. That's beautiful. But where's the policy? Where's the practice? Where's the procedure to make sure that our culture is upholding safety? That my concern is safety. And there is this misconception, and I got to call it out. Karenism is a big issue too, especially in K through 12 education. I had to get a couple of Karens in line today. I said, stop calling me and using your A-type, quote-unquote, personality as a way to deflect from the fact that this is about power. And this is about a power shift. People say they want change. And when I tell people, this is my stance. If DEI is the house and anti-racism is the foundation that it has to sit on. And people don't want that foundation, so we're building foundations out of mud, and it's looking real crazy. So I know I said a lot without saying a lot, but I'm just saying that's where my burnout is coming in. And
Absolutely. And talking about that burnout is really important because as we do this work, we have to use those words. Like when we're creating our strategies, when we're creating our resources, our plans, whatever it is, we need a space there to talk about how the industry as a whole is experiencing a level of burnout. And I think another best practice I want to give you that really resonates with organizations, Number one, there was a piece that came out about how DEI is now equivalent to $1 trillion industry. So when leaders or people with the access see that, they say, okay, we got to get behind this. But the other piece is this has to be a long-term thing, right? We talked about this. And if we only invest in the Band-Aid solutions, then everything, it's a house of cards, it falls apart. So if organizations want to be in the long road for DEI, DEIB, JEDI, whatever we're calling it, they have to invest in the practitioners that are doing this work. And that means we have to be very clear when we're asking for resources. This person can work 20 hours for this amount of money. Putting numbers to it is something I learned at Amazon that is highly effective. And I've seen a lot of other practitioners do this where when they're putting together their budget, they're averaging this amount per person per hour times how many hours you want the person to work, and that's what you're asking for in terms of resources. We have a couple other hands up, and I want to get to you all, but I did want to go through one quick slide, and then I would love to hear from you, and that's specifically about the global perspective. So at the beginning of this conversation, I asked you all what you brought to, what your unique skill set is in DEI, and personally, my unique skill set is the global perspective, and I've told you I've lived in 5 different countries, but this is a great example of, how this work again does not start and stop in one area. We're influenced by what happens outside of our borders, and that's not going to stop anytime soon. So a great example is South Africa has a program in place called, and I don't know if we call it BBEE, but it's broad-based Black employment equity, and it's something that we can definitely learn about in the US. When we point to different practices that different countries have in place, that also increases our ability to make sure that more people are on board. Because what we're effectively saying is that this is a global movement, and if you don't take, action on this, you're going to be left behind. And that's the type of language that a lot of people understand and buy into. They say, I don't want to be that person or that organization that's not taking action on this. If all of these other organizations are doing it in all these other countries, and BLM is a global movement, I want to make sure that I'm in on this too. And the other thing I want to say is that dollars. One of the most effective ways we can make change in DEI is through programs and policies and through investing in underrepresented communities through our dollars. So when you are trying to approach our organizations with what our particular ask is, ask them for an investment. Ask them for the dollars, and ask them to not sparse it out very, very, in a very scarce way, like 10,000 here, 10,000 there. Choose the organizations, use one, see the success of that and what's come out of that, and then use that to scale. Okay, so we have a couple other hands up. Okay. Kathleen, I apologize. I wish I could see who had their hands up in order. Did you want to share?
Yes, sorry. I think I'm experiencing burnout based on actually, how can I say this? More establishment people of color that are not getting it. I find that very frustrating. And I think it's because, but less so now, but I think it's because I had an expectation that there would be a certain level of understanding there because they are marginalized. But that's not really, that doesn't always translate. I am Black, by the way, and you can't see me. So when I'm talking to, I notice a lot of African people, let's say, that haven't, I know with my parents growing up in the Caribbean, everybody around them was Black. Government, people in, like, the society was Black. So I find that growing up in Canada, it took them a while to catch on to what our struggles were. Even though they themselves were facing barriers, like to employment or accessing housing, they had their own stories, but I find that I don't know if they were so focused on assimilating or where the disconnect is there. But I find it interesting that in one way that you're marginalized, it doesn't necessarily translate into understanding how other people are marginalized. So I find that a little frustrating.
Yeah, I saw this a lot at Amazon, sadly, where the leveling of different people made a difference. So some folk that may be at the higher level may not be as ready to challenge things as others. One great practice I put in place was, as you've noticed, there's a lot more comfort talking about white supremacy now than there was before. But collectively, myself and a few others spoke about how we are talking about white supremacy, but we're not necessarily talking about anti-Blackness. And that was a point that kind of resonated with others. It was punchy, and it was like, okay, yeah, we're talking about this, but are we actually talking about we're talking about one piece, but are we talking about the whole piece here? And I think that this is where community really comes in. Again, another really effective way of getting into a place of leadership is developing community roundtables. When you can do a virtual roundtable and you can bring people into conversation around perhaps a prompt or something, or trying to walk away with a best practice, then people are coming in together and you're developing those, like that network so that different people can do that work in their different areas of the organization. Okay, we have an exercise, but having spoken to all of you, my personal learning is that we have tried to do a lot in this space. And so for our next time together, I want to make sure that I lessen the number of slides and I give more time for conversation. I will call on a couple more hands, and then we have about 15 minutes for Q&A, and I'd love for you to use this Q&A either through the chat or through just putting your hand up to ask me any specific questions. I have like a number of books here that I can also recommend. A lot of them are some that you may not have heard of, but if there's any particular resources that I can offer you, I want to make sure I do that in our time together, specifically around DEI, like the language that we use, the concepts that we are introducing to different people within the organization, and how we can make sure that we bring people into that journey. So I'm just going to call on two more hands here. Omerafi, am I pronouncing your name right?
Yes, Amarfe.
Amarfe, thank you for clarifying.
Yes, I'm actually new to DEI program. I have a master in public health. So before COVID, I have a DEI specialist that came to talk to the health department, and I've been intrigued about the program, and I decided to join and learn more and find out how to break through into the market. So I've heard so much. I have a burnout in a different area, not DEI per se. So just the COVID and investigating and stuff. So I have burnout in that field, but not. I'm new to DEI, so I'm not used. I'm interested. I'm very excited about it and hearing everybody's point of view and their experiences so far. So I hope to get more feedback and understanding about the program. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you so much for sharing. And likewise, we have a lot to learn from you. All of us collectively have different experiences in different areas of DEI. So when we think about it that way, think of this as a collective. And I really encourage you all to add each other to LinkedIn, because collectively we can do so much, even in terms of our positioning, our leveling, our earnings, when we call on each other and say, hey, I know somebody here, I know somebody there, and really doing this, coming together like that. Natasha, you had your hand up.
Hi everyone, I'm Natasha from Toronto. So I've consulted a little bit in corporations. I mean, I came from a corporate background a long time ago, but I've been in entrepreneurship for quite some time. My burnout, so to speak, is really on the day-to-day me maintaining a level of patience with the ignorance. So when it comes to, for example, at work, even if I'm having a conversation and using, the vocabulary and the lingo and so on, there will always be that one person, even if the corporation has brought me in to speak, and it could be the cultural change that they're going through, that they do want to add this in there, there will always be people in the room who will be like, well, aren't they just quota fillers then? If there's this whole line of representation matters, or like the fact that you have to say representation matters means you're just a quota filler, right? And I try not to let that affect me personally, because like you, I'm a brown woman. It's not like I haven't experienced it before. I'm not trying to take it personally, but how, when we're doing our work, do we take that and then just say, okay, you know what? We're still at the beginning stages. Carry on with the patients, carry on with what we need to do, knowing that collectively we're going to help each other rise and sort of get through this. And then on the flip side, on the daily, day-to-day talks, it could be as simple as what's going on in Ukraine right now. Not that that's simple, but with what's going on in Ukraine right now, and I'm sitting here in Canada, it's a diverse city in Toronto, and a conversation happened within strangers at a coffee shop, and we're all saying, well, we're all immigrants to this country, so we should know what that feels like when we've got, the people that are working in front of us who are from Ukraine and their families are suffering. We're all immigrants. We all know what that feels like to have our parents or families have to leave a country and come over. And one person then stands up and says, well, I'm not an immigrant to this country, because he himself feels, well, my grandparents and great grandparents have been here, so we own this country. And I said, well, surely your family comes from another country. We all are on borrowed land here. And so my burnout is more of a frustration, where we're doing the work that we can in the workplace, we're invited there to speak on the topic, and yet we still get the ignorance. And then yet you go get a simple coffee outside, and there's a collective conversation going on where people are trying to support people of Ukraine, and really, to be honest, they're white-skinned, right? But it doesn't matter, because they're just humans at the end of the day. And then you still have someone else who feels that they need to feel powerful in that moment. Well, I'm not an immigrant. We technically own this country because my parents or great grandparents came here first. So at that moment, I don't want to second guess myself and say, okay, well, why am I even doing this? What is the point? That's in that slight moment, that's what I feel.
Sure. One of my learnings is, I think part of the reason why this happens is that there's still a questioning of the industry. There's still a questioning of what, despite the research, despite the books, despite everything. I mean, we're seeing it with critical race theory right now. There's always going to be the naysayers, and in trying to manage our own burnout, our own mental health, trying to stay in this industry because we believe in it, one of the coping mechanisms is to not convince people who have chosen not to be convinced, right? So work with I can't say this for every organization, but my experience within a matrixed organization such as Amazon is there are people there that believe in this work. And rather than going through the position that we're in, whether it's our direct manager or skip or, go to the people that are on board already. Because if we look at it percentage wise, if 50% of our work is convincing others and that 50% is removed because we're working with people that are already convinced, it can make a world of a difference. So that's what I would recommend. And the other piece is coming back to what I said initially, which is pull on those resources. We're at a time when people have done extensive research as to, I think we're in the fourth wave of immigration now in Canada, but when people see the numbers attached to it, the research attached to it, they're no longer looking at us to convince them, because we all are embedded within a power dynamic. They're looking to people that have had something formally published or something like that. So I think that's really effective in trying to get people, and always start with your ask. So if your ask is, you know what, I want $100,000 to run this program, to make sure I create a partnership program for Black, Indigenous, people of color organizations, and I want to split it among 3 organizations. When we start with our ask, what that essentially does is save us the time, because if somebody has decided that they're not on, we're not wasting the next half hour exhausting ourselves trying to convince themselves otherwise. So I hope that helps, and I think that we have a lot that we need to, work through here, but I really want to make sure that I present you with the best practices so that we can do this work to the best of our ability. One of the principles I live by is progress over perfection. We're never going to get this 100%. Maybe by the time this course is over, DEI will just be in a different place than it is now. But what we want to do is make that incremental change so that, it's not continuously in the same place that we're in before. So we have a lot of hands up, and the chat is quite full. I want to just tell you 2 things. Number 1, this is being recorded. So if you felt like there was something that was mentioned and you didn't get the full name of it, please, the chat is there for you to go back and look at, but do use our WhatsApp conversation and our Google Classroom to ask those questions. I want to make sure I'm giving you these resources. What I do suggest is perhaps creating a folder in your on your laptop or desktop to house these resources, because I've pulled the resources that I've shared and a lot of you have shared here is a great place to share when you need to. And yes, sorry, I didn't mean to say WhatsApp, I meant the Discord channel. It's on my WhatsApp, so I would definitely click on those, save as, keep them in a folder so that you can pull on them when need be. And then the other piece is I am going to save this chat, so I'm going to make sure that I go back and address some of the questions or comments that you had here. In terms of questions specifically about resources or anything specific to DEI concepts and sharing that to, make sure that we get the resources that we need, is there anything that you wanted to ask me? And Luz, I did see your hand up for a while, so I want to make sure that I give you the chance to ask your question. Please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So, hi everybody. I'm super excited to dive in and hear all this feedback. There are some questions that I would like to ask, because ultimately for me, my journey is spiritual. And I see D&I work as the ultimate spiritual circle, like you mentioned earlier. I hear often call in versus call out, but Andre said it in the beginning when he didn't have the closed captioning, he got called out for it. So even just speaking right now, I have a little bit of courage to step up and say this, because I do see a lot of blaming, pointing, labeling, that kind of energy. And what I wrote in the chat box earlier is, it's not about me being superior or inferior. It's ultimately about equal. Because like you said, ultimately we're all souls. And that's where I feel the D&I conversation is leading to. And like children, we're learning how to stand and ultimately step and then walk and then run. And I get it. It's going to be hurtful. We're going to fall and we'll cry. But I feel that sometimes the energy in D&I spaces can be very fearful and aggressive and judgmental. So I want to communicate that.
Can I speak to this, considering it was my comment that this is stemming to? The reason I bring up the language of small and big, right? Because it's very accessible to people's knowledge already of how it relates. I also go into EDI from a very spiritual sense because it is a lot of reclaiming of my culture, seeing as how a lot of the socialism, equitable, intersectional application of just culture, care, compassion, empathy, language, mental health, right? Even in indigenous ideology, the whole concept of our purpose here is that we have responsibilities to the earth and each other, not that we have rights and individualisms to take what we want. And it's still important, right? When we think about the language of responsibility, responsibility still has boundaries because we are constantly in pivoting and agile motion with one another, constantly bouncing boundaries. Because it's important. It's how we advocate for ourselves, and it's also how we advocate for the space that we consume in this shared space. And so the reason I said the emotional labor of constantly being the bigger person is because yes, we are all equitable and equal to the deservement of care, compassion, and humility and humanity. However, the labor of that is always been on the back of people of the global majority. And it's not saying that we are no longer going to be people who are practicing and pushing that responsibility. It's that we shouldn't be the only ones. And so in that space, just because I'm the most informed doesn't mean I need to be the only one speaking when being vulnerable, reflecting, and having these conversations of discomfort. And as we know, the label of aggressiveness and being uncomfortable in spaces where white supremacy is questioned, that identity of discomfort is what should be questioned in that moment, not whether or not I'm calling you in a polite tone.
And I cannot follow up with that, Saudia, too, because
yes.
I wanted to snap to that, and I wanted to lose, and I say this with all love and intentionality, and this is not to be harmful, but I have to say this. We have to even be careful of how we describe DE&I, especially, and I want to use the word you used, aggressive. That's a really challenging word because oftentimes aggressive is a dog whistle, right? And so we have to be careful of how we confuse. Sometimes it's not calling out, it's calling out white supremacy. And my calling that out and your reaction to it, that has nothing to do with me. I'm gonna be honest, right? Because too often times black and brown people or people of color in this work are police, and that's tone policing. Well, we gotta be nice about it, but that's why we still continue. We're in this work for a reason, right? I wish there was no racism. I wish there wasn't oppression. I wish there wasn't marginalization, but that's not the reality. So we have to be brave. And I love that people in the chat are lighting it up and talking about brave space conversations and safe. This another one, safe space. That is also rooted in white supremacist ideology of how to lead into these conversations. Because who is this safe for? Certainly not the folks who are talking about, right? If we're trying to make structural and systemic change. So, Luz, I want to just offer you that, and I want to share also to another book, How to Talk About Race by Ajuna Oluwu, because we really have to be intentional, especially I am a dark-skinned Black woman, right? Yes, period. I see it right there, Jai. We have to be intentional about how we use language to communicate, because when we oftentimes refer to aggression and the way I talk, I'm from New York City, I'm from Harlem, born and raised. And sometimes when I talk AAVE and I talk with my hands, somebody literally told me I had to be coached out of my excitement. So I was the right woman, no one would ever think that. They would call me a leader. I'm sorry.
Not at all. Not at all. I appreciate this conversation. This is what, the DEI work is about. But I really appreciate you mentioning this book. I would definitely recommend it. So you want to talk about race. Another book that I would recommend, and I think this is really, it explains why we have DEI to begin with, is Caste. If you read Caste, it's a pretty thick book, but even if you start with the first chapter, you can understand that we're not starting on an even playing field here. We're starting on an uneven playing field. And what DEI is designed to do, and maybe this is a fault of the industry, is we speak as if everybody's equal, but you can't be equal if you don't start equal. And I would love to use myself as an example. As a brown woman, I have a very different experience as an immigrant to the US than somebody who has been enslaved and brought here. So I encourage us to, yes, call people in, and yes, create both brave and safe spaces, but context matters. In fact, even when we write our DEI strategies and we put this in the framework of a workplace, how do we actually take this and apply this to work? I start all my pieces with context. And what I'm saying is, this work does not begin today. This work began a long time ago with the enslavement of people on the land that we're on. And where we are in that world, the context shifts, right? I mean, there's a thread, like we saw with the Black Lives Matter movements globally. Anti-Blackness is global, and colonialism is global. But adding in that context can prevent us from saying, let's all just, but we are at time. And I think this was actually a really good start to what we're going to go into. And before I let you go, I just wanted to bring you back to this piece. Remember that where we are is right here, right? So this was an initial conversation. And what we're going to go into next week is intersectionality. For your assignment, this isn't optional, but what I'm going to ask you to do is, right here. It is, I apologize.
Would it also be okay if we had the chat option there where we can chat with other people? Because for some reason the chat option was turned off, and this makes it, because I think there's a lot of conversations on here that are really side conversations.
Yes.
And so if we could have that chat option, that'd be awesome.
Yes, and I just want to encourage, please do use the chat to connect with each other. And number two, share resources. And I don't just mean resources like books, but actual things that lead to practice. And for our assignment, it was, how would you explain DEI to people in different levels of the organization? So if you were to explain this to people that were individual contributors, people managers, and very often upper management who don't know, what would that look like? Like, would you explain it the same way? And this conversation has taught us that often people who are not, running the companies are the ones that have the most experience with it. So how do we create that conversation so people are brought into the work? So thank you for your time and for me learning from you. In the spirit of mental health and burnout, I do want to encourage you to take time to just breathe, reset, connect with each other, foster that community, and reach out to me for whatever you need. And I am looking forward to seeing you on Tuesday.